Hello everyone and welcome back to Biznesie po angielsku, the podcast for professionals who want to develop their business English through practical ideas, authentic business situations and conversations that go beyond grammar and vocabulary. I'm Eva and I'm delighted you've decided to spend some time with me today. I'm recording this episode in the middle of what seems to be one of the biggest heat waves we've seen across Europe in quite a while. So wherever you are listening from, I really hope you are staying safe and looking after yourselves. Here in Gdynia, where I live, the temperature has already cooled down a bit, but I know there are still parts of Poland where it's incredibly hot. So I genuinely sympathize with those of you who prefer colder weather. Anyway, whether you are commuting, working, or perhaps enjoying a well-deserved holiday, thank you for making this podcast part of your day. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to everyone who has joined me through the Strategic Business English Collection podbook. It's been truly rewarding to see so many professionals using my latest podbook to build not only your English, but also the diplomatic communication skills and strategic language needed to navigate today's international business world. Thank you for your continued support, your feedback, and for choosing to learn with me. I truly appreciate it. Now, before we move on to today's topic, there is something I'd love to share with you, my dear listeners. Well, if you follow me on Instagram, you'll probably remember that a few weeks ago, when His Majesty King Charles III visited the United States, I dedicated several posts to his speech before the United States Congress. And as you know, the speech absolutely went down a storm. It was full of thoughtful observations, beautifully articulated, and delivered with exceptional diplomacy, elegance, and that unmistakable British dry humour and flair. Well, I certainly wasn't the only one who thought so. I think it's fair to say that King Charles won over quite a few new admirers that day. Anyway, having heard Charles's speech a few times, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I shared my reflections on Instagram with you and naturally with many of my students during our lessons. But then another thought crossed my mind. Why not write directly to the king? Not because I expected anything in return, but simply because I wanted to congratulate him on such a good speech and tell him how much I appreciate both its message and the way it had been delivered. I know exactly what some of you might be thinking. It sounds a little like writing a letter to Father Christmas. But I've always had quite a lot of childlike curiosity and enthusiasm, so once the idea appeared, I simply decided to go for it. I certainly can't tell you that writing the letter to the king was my bread and butter. Well, finding the right words took me a little while. I wanted everything to sound respectful, elegant, and appropriate for such an address, so the whole process definitely brought me a few headaches. But come on, writing the letter to the king is not something you do on a regular basis. So, eventually, after countless little edits, I sealed the envelope, took it to the post office, and sent it off to Buckingham Palace. Oh, I still remember the rather puzzled expression on the lady's face as she stamped the envelope. Then I simply forgot about it, until yesterday evening. Robert, my husband, had just come back from his evening walk with the dogs while I happened to be having a shower. And he shouted to me, "Eva, a letter from Buckingham Palace has just arrived." And I was like, "No shit, you've got to be kidding me." Not at all, love. It's got the king's cipher and the Buckingham Palace stamp. Well, I couldn't exactly dash out of the bathroom with soaking wet hair, So I finished as quickly as I possibly could and rushed over to him, wondering if Robert was pulling my leg again, which frankly he always enjoys doing. But this time he wasn't. The envelope from Buckingham Palace landed in my hands. We opened it very carefully and started reading. Now I think this is probably the perfect moment to read it to you as well. I'm sure you are curious. Interestingly, in the top left-hand corner, it says private and confidential. However, I think it's perfectly acceptable to share its contents with you. So here is the letter. Dear Mrs. Domarecka, thank you for your message to the King regarding Their Majesty's recent state visit to the United States of America. The time you have taken to write and share your thoughts is appreciated. The King visited the President and First Lady to reaffirm the enduring relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States upon the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. As His Majesty said in his address to the joint meeting of Congress in Washington, the story of the United Kingdom and the United States is at its heart a story of reconciliation, renewal, and remarkable partnership. From the bitter divisions of 250 years ago, we forged a friendship that has grown into one of the most consequential alliances in human history. The King wishes me to thank you once again for writing. This letter comes with the warmest of good wishes. Yours sincerely, James Dawson, Head of Royal Correspondence. So, as you can hear, the letter is clearly formal, but it never sounds cold or stiff. In fact, that's one of the things I admire most about British communication. Even in highly official correspondence, the language remains warm, respectful, and remarkably gracious. It's elegant without being elaborate and diplomatic without sounding vague. The language is measured and courteous. Rather than trying to impress with the vocabulary, it creates a sense of dignity through precision and restraint. Well, I hope you found that story as enjoyable as I did. But now, let's get to the main story of today's episode. As it happens, the story I shared with you leads us very nicely to today's topic, small talk. It's something that many people tend to underestimate. It often gets dismissed as superficial, unnecessary, or simply a polite way to fill awkward silence. But the interesting paradox is that the conversations many professionals may consider the least important often become the moments that shape trust, strengthen relationships, and ultimately open doors to new opportunities. So in this episode, ladies and gentlemen, we'll look at small talk from a rather different perspective. We'll explore why it matters so much in international business, what role it really plays, and how a few seemingly ordinary conversations can have a much greater impact than we might expect. Right then, let's begin. Have you ever noticed how many people complain about small talk, especially in Poland? I hear the same thing over and over again. I hate it when people ask me, how are you? They don't really care anyway. And yes, understand where that feeling comes from. If you interpret, how are you? Literally, it can sound superficial or even annoying. But in the Anglo-Saxon business culture, the intention behind that question is almost always innocuous. It isn't an invitation to discuss your health, your stress levels, or your family problems. It's a courteous way of saying, I acknowledge you. I'm happy to see you. Let's establish a positive connection before we get down to business. I believe one reason this feels so unfamiliar to many people in our culture is that we often expect a conversation to serve a clear purpose. So we tend to initiate conversations because we have something to communicate, a question to ask, or a piece of information to share. In other words, the focus shifts from politeness to information. So, for example, if you've just received a letter from Buckingham Palace, that's a perfectly good reason to start a conversation. You have something interesting to share. But starting a conversation simply to make someone feel welcome or included may seem unnecessary to many of us. In many English-speaking cultures, however, that's precisely the point. Small talk isn't there to exchange important information. Rather, its purpose is to signal acceptance, friendliness, and openness. And it's a subtle way of saying you are part of this conversation. You are welcome here. So I suppose that difference in expectations explains why so many misunderstandings arise. One person thinks, why are we talking if there is nothing to say? While the other thinks, why wouldn't we talk? That's exactly how we build relationships. Another misconception is that small talk is simply a moment to touch base. Of course, you might briefly ask how someone's week has been or whether a project is progressing well. But reducing small talk to exchanging updates means missing its real value. It's worth remembering that small talk acts as a social bridge, allowing people to feel comfortable before moving on to more substantial conversations. Then there are people who believe that small talk is simply chit-chat, something completely unessential, a waste of time before the real meeting begins. That's a very common perception, particularly in more task-oriented cultures. But from the British-American perspective, that so-called inessential conversation often determines the quality of the business relationship that follows. Look, before people buy your ideas, they often want to buy into you. Some people make another mistake. They assume it's the perfect opportunity to exchange gossip, or even better, to whine a little about work, the economy, the weather, their boss, or basically the whole world. Unfortunately, that's where small talk can develop quite a bad reputation. And if every conversation turns into a complaint session, people begin to associate you with negativity. And I think we can all agree that nobody really enjoys spending time with someone who constantly complains. You know, I really think small talk should leave people feeling better after talking to you rather than emotionally exhausted. And here's another situation. Imagine you are standing with colleagues and suddenly they are discussing a sports event you don't really follow, a TV program you are not familiar with, or a city you've never visited. You are completely out of the loop. So is it a good idea to simply escape the conversation? Absolutely not. In fact, it's one of the best opportunities to strengthen the relationship. So instead of worrying that you have nothing to contribute, simply redirect the conversation. You can say, hey, I've never actually followed that. What am I missing? What is it that you enjoy about it? Or, oh, that sounds interesting. How did you get into it? Or perhaps, I've never been there. Would you recommend it? What's your take on that? Or simply, oh, tell me more. I'd love to know your feelings. And now notice what happens. The spotlight moves away from you and onto the other person. People generally enjoy talking about things they genuinely care about. At the same time, you begin learning something about them. Their interests, experiences, values, personality, perhaps even what motivates them outside work. And those are the details that help you build genuine rapport, and they often make your next conversation much easier. Interestingly, one thing I frequently see, particularly among non-native speakers, is that feeling they need to impress people by talking continuously. Yet the opposite is usually true. Don't monopolize the conversation. Ask thoughtful questions. Listen carefully. Be curious. A good rule of thumb is this. Don't get straight to the point the moment you meet someone. Take a minute or two to exchange pleasantries, strike up a few questions, and create an atmosphere where the business conversation can naturally develop. Ironically, those two seemingly insignificant minutes often save you 10 minutes of awkwardness later. And that doesn't mean you should beat about the bush forever. Small talk has its place, and once it has done its job, people naturally move into business. If the conversation starts to run dry, don't panic. That's perfectly normal. And it's often the signal that everyone is ready to move on to the meeting itself. It's also worth remembering that some topics can easily put somebody in a difficult position. Questions about salary, politics, religion, family planning, health issues, or personal finances are often far too personal, especially if you've only just met. Even seemingly innocent jokes can become overly familiar if the relationship hasn't been established yet. Small talk should reduce social risk, not increase it. Ultimately, small talk isn't about filling silence with random words or engaging in meaningless natter. Nor is it about pretending to be extroverted if you are naturally quiet. It's about creating a situation where people feel comfortable enough to trust you, collaborate with you, and eventually do business with you. I hope you found today's episode both interesting and worthwhile. If you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a like or share your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to hear your perspective. What do you think about small talk in business? What do you find the most challenging about it? Or perhaps you are one of those people who genuinely enjoy it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And before we finish, if you haven't yet had the opportunity to explore my latest podbook, the Strategic Business English Collection, I'd really encourage you to do so. It's a resource designed to help you understand how the language of business diplomacy really works in English. We explore the language of influence, strategic communication, and the subtle choices that help professionals build credibility, authority, and stronger business relationships. I devoted a great deal of time and care to creating it, making sure it would not only be practical, but also full of interesting insights into how communication works in international business. You'll find the link to the description of this episode, as well as in my Instagram bio. And now, folks, it's time for me to move to a rather different project, one that's much more personal than professional. This summer, I'm finally making one of my long-held dreams come true by creating our own garden from scratch. We've been working on it for the past 2 weeks, and we've already reached several important milestones, including installing the irrigation system. We are now at the planting stage, which is undoubtedly the most enjoyable part of the whole project. So hopefully we'll soon have the garden we've been dreaming of. So, dear listeners, it's time to call it a day. As we are now at the beginning of the holiday season, I'd like to wish everyone wonderful holidays, unforgettable adventures, and plenty of sunshine wherever you happen to be. Stay well. Goodbye.